Have you ever wondered how a notorious criminal could escape a maximum security facility using nothing but a piece of wood and some shoe polish? The story sounds like a myth or a scene from a Hollywood movie, but it is a documented historical event that humiliated law enforcement and turned a bank robber into a folk hero. On a cold morning in March 1934, John Dillinger defied the odds and broke out of a jail that was deemed escape-proof by the very people who built it. This event did not just free a man, it shattered the illusion of police invincibility during the height of the Great Depression. The audacity of the plan and the simplicity of the weapon remain a subject of fascination nearly a century later. The United States in the early 1930s was a nation gripped by fear and poverty. The Great Depression had decimated the economy, leaving millions unemployed and desperate. In this climate of despair, bank robbers were often viewed not as villains, but as Robin Hood figures striking back at the financial institutions that had failed the common man. John Dillinger rose to prominence in this chaotic era. His charm and daring heists captivated the public imagination. Newspapers splashed his face across front pages, turning his crime spree into a national serial drama. However, the law was closing in, and the authorities were determined to end his run. They believed they finally had him cornered in a place from which no man could leave. John Dillinger was already a seasoned criminal by the time he arrived in Indiana. He had raided police stations for weapons and robbed banks across multiple states. His gang was known for their precision and speed, often striking and vanishing before police could organize a response. But even the most slippery fugitives make mistakes. In January 1934, Dillinger and his gang were captured in Tucson, Arizona. The arrest was almost anticlimactic as a fire at their hotel led to their discovery. The authorities in Indiana fought hard to have him extradited, eager to try him for the murder of a police officer during a previous bank robbery in East Chicago. The destination for the famous outlaw was the Lake County Jail in Crown Point, Indiana. This facility was not an ordinary small-town lockup. It was a fortress of concrete and steel, designed to hold the most dangerous criminals in the state. The authorities boasted loudly about the security features of the building. They claimed the bars were saw-proof and the guards were incorruptible. The sheriff in charge was Lillian Holly, a woman who had taken over the position after her husband, the previous sheriff, was killed in the line of duty. She was determined to prove that her jail could hold public enemy number one without incident. When John Dillinger arrived at Crown Point, the scene was chaotic. Crowds of spectators gathered just to catch a glimpse of the famous gangster. Reporters and photographers swarmed the entrance, creating a circus atmosphere. Inside the jail, Dillinger appeared relaxed and confident. He smiled for the cameras and even leaned on the shoulder of the prosecutor Robert Estill for a photograph. This image would later come back to haunt Estill, effectively ending his political career. The public saw a man who was not afraid of the law. Dillinger seemed to treat his imprisonment as a temporary inconvenience rather than a final defeat. Sheriff Lillian Holly increased the guard rotation and added extra deputies to the perimeter. She was under immense pressure from both the state and federal government to ensure nothing went wrong. The jail was a labyrinth of steel doors and checkpoints. To escape, a prisoner would need to pass through multiple locked barriers and get past dozens of armed men. The idea that anyone could walk out of there was laughable to the officials in charge. They confiscated every personal item from Dillinger and subjected him to constant surveillance. Yet they underestimated the resourcefulness of a man with nothing left to lose. Inside his cell, John Dillinger began to observe the routines of his captors. He noted when the guards changed shifts and which deputies seemed complacent. He realized that the sheer number of guards created a false sense of security. They assumed the physical barriers were enough. Dillinger knew he could not overpower them with force, so he decided to use psychology. He needed a weapon, but he had no way to smuggle one inside. The only option was to manufacture one from the materials available to him. This required patience and a steady hand, both of which he possessed in abundance. The legend states that Dillinger obtained a small block of wood, perhaps from a piece of washboard or a shelf. Over several days, he whittled the wood using a razor blade or a small knife he had managed to conceal. He carved the wood into the shape of a Colt semi-automatic pistol. The work was crude, but in the dim light of the jail corridors, it would pass for the real thing. To complete the illusion, he needed to darken the wood. He used black shoe polish to stain the fake gun, giving it the metallic sheen of a deadly weapon. He hid this wooden prop in his cell, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The morning of March 3, 1934, began like any other at the Lake County Jail. The guards were going about their morning routines, cleaning the corridors and checking the cells. The atmosphere was calm and quiet. At around 9 in the morning, a trustee named Sam Calhoun came to the section where Dillinger was held to do some cleaning. This was the opportunity the gangster had been waiting for. The trusted inmate had access to the corridor, and his presence would bring a guard within reach. Dillinger stood ready in his cell, gripping the wooden object in his hand. As Sam Calhoun worked near the cell, John Dillinger called him over. When the man approached, Dillinger pressed the wooden barrel against the bars and into the ribs of the trustee. He whispered a threat, claiming he would shoot if Calhoun made a sound. The bluff was instant and terrifying. Calhoun froze, believing the gun was real. Dillinger then demanded that Calhoun call the nearest guard. The plan hinged entirely on the fear of the weapon. If anyone looked closely or called his bluff, the escape would be over before it began. But in the high-tension environment of the jail, no one wanted to take that risk. A guard named Herbert, no relation to the prisoner, approached the cell to see what was happening. Dillinger aimed the blackened wood at him through the bars. The guard saw the silhouette of a gun and immediately complied. Dillinger ordered him to unlock the cell door. With trembling hands, the guard opened the heavy steel gate. John Dillinger stepped out into the corridor. He was now free from his cell, but he was still deep inside the fortress. He had to navigate his way out without raising the alarm, and he needed to neutralize the rest of the staff. Dillinger moved quickly and quietly. He forced the guard and the trustee to walk ahead of him, acting as human shields. They moved toward the main office, where more deputies were stationed. As they encountered other guards, Dillinger used the same tactic. He brandished the fake weapon and barked orders with absolute conviction. One by one, the guards surrendered. They were herded into a cell and locked up. The sheer confidence of Dillinger convinced seasoned lawmen that they were staring down the barrel of a loaded .45 caliber pistol. The situation escalated when Dillinger reached the communications room. He needed to ensure no one could call for outside help. He disabled the telephone switchboard, cutting off the jail from the rest of the world. By this point, he had rounded up a significant number of the jail staff. It was a surreal scene. One man, armed with a piece of wood, was holding an entire squad of deputies hostage. The psychological dominance he exerted was total. He moved with the authority of a commander, and the guards obeyed him, instinctively fearing for their lives. Among the prisoners was a man named Herbert Youngblood. He was an African-American inmate awaiting trial for murder. Dillinger decided to take Youngblood with him, perhaps needing an extra pair of hands, or simply offering a chance at freedom to a fellow captive. Youngblood grabbed a plunger handle to use as a club and joined the escape. Together, they continued to round up the remaining staff. They eventually reached the warden office, where the real weapons were stored. This was the critical turning point of the escape. Inside the office, John Dillinger finally acquired legitimate firepower. He grabbed 2 Thompson submachine guns and several revolvers. Now the threat was real. He discarded the wooden prop or pocketed it and brandished the heavy automatic weapons. The dynamic shifted from a bluff to a deadly standoff. With real guns in hand, Dillinger and Youngblood were formidable. They forced the remaining guards to open the final doors leading to the garage. The path to freedom was now clear, but they still needed a getaway vehicle. The garage contained 2 cars belonging to the sheriff department. Dillinger selected the personal vehicle of Sheriff Lillian Holly, a fast Ford V8. This car was the pride of the department, powerful enough to outrun almost anything else on the road. The irony of stealing the sheriff car was not lost on Dillinger. He loaded the weapons into the back seat. He kept a deputy named Ernest Blunk as a hostage to drive the car and ensure they could pass through the outer gates without being fired upon. Ernest Blunk drove the car out of the garage and into the streets of Crown Point. The town was quiet, unaware that the most dangerous man in America was driving through their midst in the sheriff car. They moved slowly at first to avoid attracting attention. Once they were clear of the immediate vicinity of the jail, Dillinger ordered Blunk to head towards the state line. The escape had been executed perfectly. No shots were fired and no one was injured. It was a masterclass in planning and improvisation. The drive north was tense. Dillinger sat in the back seat with a machine gun vigilant for any police pursuit. Youngblood sat in the front. They navigated the rural roads of Indiana, heading toward the urban sprawl of Chicago. The weather was cold and the roads were slick. As they drove, Dillinger chatted with the hostage Ernest Blunk. He seemed almost jovial, relieved to be out of the cage. He even offered the deputy a cigarette. This strange camaraderie between captor and captive was a hallmark of the Dillinger style. However, during this drive, John Dillinger made a critical error that would eventually lead to his downfall. He crossed the state line from Indiana into Illinois while driving the stolen sheriff car. Under the National Motor Vehicle Theft Act, also known as the Dyer Act, transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines was a federal offense. This gave the FBI, headed by J Edgar Hoover, the legal jurisdiction to hunt him down directly. Until that moment, his crimes were largely state matters. By crossing that invisible line, he brought the full weight of the federal government upon himself. Back in Crown Point, the alarm was finally raised. The guards who had been locked in the cell managed to attract attention. When Sheriff Lillian Holly found out what had happened, she was furious. The press descended on the town once again, but this time the tone was different. The authorities were ridiculed. Cartoons in newspapers depicted the police cowering before a wooden toy. The reputation of the escape-proof jail was in tatters. Sheriff Holly faced immense criticism and sexism from the public, who blamed her gender for the failure. John Dillinger released his hostage Ernest Blunk unharmed once they were safely in Chicago. He gave the deputies some money for a train ticket back to Crown Point. This final act of courtesy cemented his legend as a gentleman bandit. Dillinger vanished into the labyrinth of the city, reuniting with his gang and planning his next moves. But the landscape had changed. The FBI was now mobilizing a special task force dedicated solely to his capture. The wooden gun escape was his greatest triumph, but it also marked the beginning of the end. The story of the wooden gun spread like wildfire across the country. It became a symbol of the underdog, outsmarting the system. People in breadlines and shantytowns cheered for the outlaw who could humiliate the powerful banks and the police. However, the embarrassment felt by law enforcement transformed into a cold rage. John Edgar Hoover declared Dillinger public enemy number one and ordered his agents to shoot to kill. The manhunt that followed was unprecedented in its scale and intensity. Debate continues to this day about the authenticity of the wooden gun. Some historians argue that Dillinger may have had a real gun smuggled in by a corrupt lawyer or judge. They claim the wooden gun story was fabricated by Dillinger to further humiliate the police, or by the police to excuse their surrender to a lone man. However, the wooden gun itself remains part of the lore. Dillinger reportedly showed it to his lawyer later, claiming he carved it with a razor. Whether it was the sole weapon or part of a larger conspiracy, the psychological impact was the same. Life on the run became increasingly difficult for John Dillinger. His face was too well known. He underwent painful plastic surgery to alter his appearance, attempting to remove his famous cleft chin and change the shape of his nose. He even tried to burn off his fingerprints with acid. Despite these drastic measures, he could not escape his identity. The FBI was closing in, tracking his associates and squeezing his support network. The carefree days of robbing banks and posing for photos were over. Herbert Youngblood, the man who escaped with Dillinger, did not enjoy his freedom for long. He separated from Dillinger shortly after reaching Chicago. Less than 2 weeks later, Youngblood was cornered by police in Port Huron, Michigan. A shootout ensued, resulting in the death of Youngblood and a sheriff deputy. His brief taste of liberty ended in violence, a grim foreshadowing of the fate awaiting the rest of the gang. Dillinger, however, remained elusive, moving between safe houses in Chicago and St. Paul. The FBI tracked Dillinger to a lodge in Little Bohemia, Wisconsin, in April 1934. They surrounded the building, hoping to ambush the gang. The raid was a disaster. The agents opened fire on a car containing innocent civilians, killing one and injuring others. In the confusion, Dillinger and his men escaped through the back windows and fled into the woods. The failure at Little Bohemia was another public relations nightmare for the FBI, but it only hardened their resolve. They knew they needed an insider to catch him. That insider proved to be Anna Campanas, also known as Anna Sage. She was a Romanian immigrant facing deportation for running a brothel. She approached the authorities with a deal. She would deliver John Dillinger in exchange for the reward money and a halt to her deportation proceedings. She was the girlfriend of Polly Hamilton, who was currently dating Dillinger. Anna Sage became known as the Lady in Red because she wore an orange skirt that appeared red under the streetlights on the night she set the trap. On July 22, 1934, Anna Sage, Polly Hamilton, and John Dillinger went to the Biograph Theater in Chicago to see a movie. The film was Manhattan Melodrama, a crime story starring Clark Gable. Outside the theater, FBI agents led by Melvin Purvis lay in wait. They had the exits covered and were ready to execute the order to shoot. The heat was stifling that night, and the tension among the agents was palpable. They waited for the movie to end, knowing that this would be the final confrontation. As Dillinger exited the theater, he sensed something was wrong. He glanced at the men closing in around him. According to official reports, he reached for a pistol in his pocket. 3 agents opened fire. John Dillinger was struck 4 times and fell face down on the pavement. He died instantly. The man who had defied stone walls and steel bars was finally stopped by bullets. Crowds gathered almost immediately, some dipping handkerchiefs in his blood as macabre souvenirs. The era of the celebrity outlaw had come to a violent conclusion. The legacy of the wooden gun, escape, endures as the defining moment of the Dillinger legend. It encapsulates the mix of charm danger and anti-authority sentiment that defined the era. The jail in Crown Point still stands today, though it is no longer used to house prisoners. It serves as a historical site where visitors can see the cell that failed to hold the most famous criminal in America. The escape remains a testament to the power of psychological warfare and the fragility of perceived security. But what happened to the wooden gun itself? Its fate is as mysterious as the man who carved it. Some reports say Dillinger left it in the stolen car. Others say he kept it as a trophy. Over the years, several wooden guns have surfaced at auctions and in museums, each claiming to be the original. Family members of the sheriff and collectors have vied for ownership of the truth. Regardless of whether the physical object survives, the story it created is permanent. It is a reminder that sometimes a bluff is as powerful as a bullet.